She raised that blind girl alone for 10 years, taught her the world by touch, by sound, by heart, no formal custody, no legal rights, just love. Then one afternoon, a black SUV pulled up. 4 lawyers, dark suits, thick folders. They didn't call ahead. They just walked toward her porch, and in that moment she couldn't tell if they were there to rip that child from her arms forever or to hand her a fortune she never knew existed. This is Miss Claudia, 67 years old. She lives on a fixed income in a house with chipped paint on the porch. The girl tucked behind her is Harmony, her granddaughter, blind since birth. For a decade, Miss Claudia has been everything: mother, teacher, protector. But here's what made this particular door knock so dangerous. Miss Claudia never had legal custody, not a single paper. And if those lawyers were here on behalf of the biological parents, she could lose that child in the time it takes to sign a document. Because here's what most people don't understand: raising a child for 10 years doesn't give you the right to keep them. To understand why that knock on the door felt like a death sentence, you have to go back 10 years, to a night when Miss Claudia was 57 years old, sitting on that same porch, when a car pulled up and her daughter got out holding a 6-month-old baby wrapped in a thin blanket. Her daughter's eyes were hollow. She said she needed a few days to get clean, just a few days. She handed Claudia the baby and drove away. Claudia never saw her again. The baby was Harmony, born completely blind, optic nerve hypoplasia. Her eyes couldn't send signals to her brain. The doctors said she would never see light, never see faces, never see anything. They also said she needed specialists, early intervention, a structured environment. Claudia was a retired cafeteria worker with arthritis in both hands and a high school diploma from a segregated school in Mississippi. She had no training, no resources, no warning, just a baby who couldn't see and a daughter who had disappeared into the streets. But here's what happened next. Claudia didn't call the state. She'd seen what happened to black children in the foster system. She'd seen what happened to disabled black children. So instead, she taught herself. She spent hours at the library reading books on blindness, on tactile learning, on how to map a world for a child who can't see it. She got down on her hands and knees and showed Harmony where the furniture was by letting her bump into it gently, then teaching her to count steps. She turned every sound into a landmark: the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the third floorboard from the door, the different birds in the yard. She taught that girl to see with her ears and her fingers and her skin. And by the time Harmony was 3, she could navigate the whole house alone, pouring her own juice, finding her shoes, climbing into her grandmother's lap and saying, "I know you by your heart. Not by your voice, by your heart." But none of that counted in a courtroom, because Claudia never filed for legal custody. She didn't know how. She couldn't afford a lawyer. And most of all, she was terrified that if she brought herself to the attention of Child Protective Services, they'd decide a 60-year-old woman with arthritis and a fixed income wasn't fit to raise a blind child. So she stayed invisible, and her invisibility kept them together for a decade. Here's a number that will make your stomach turn. According to the US Census, fewer than 20% of grandparents raising grandchildren have any form of legal custody. That means over 80% of those families are one phone call away from losing everything. No legal right to make medical decisions, no legal right to enroll the child in school, no legal right to keep them if a biological parent shows up. That was Claudia's life. 10 years of showing up, 10 years of sacrifice, 10 years of love, and on paper, she was a stranger to the child she'd raised. Then 6 months ago, a letter arrived, certified mail, from a law firm in Atlanta. A man named Derek Cole had died in a highway accident. He was 39 years old. He left behind an estate worth just under $3 million, properties, savings, a small business. And in his will, he named one beneficiary, his daughter Harmony Cole, a daughter he'd never met, never provided for, never acknowledged while he was alive. But somewhere in those final years, guilt had caught up with him, so he wrote her name down. And with that signature, he set a legal bomb under the only home Harmony had ever known. Because here's the thing about money. As soon as the biological mother found out, the same woman who'd vanished for 10 years, she hired a lawyer. She filed an emergency custody petition, claiming Claudia was elderly, infirm, and exploiting the child for financial gain. She claimed Claudia had never been a real guardian, and legally she was right. Claudia had no standing, no documents. No proof except a decade of sleepless nights and homemade Braille flashcards. The courts set a hearing. Claudia scraped together a lawyer from legal aid, but she was up against a hired firm with resources she couldn't match. The judge froze the inheritance until custody was resolved. And everyone, The lawyers, the mother, the state, circled toward the same question: who really had the right to raise this child? That's what brought the black SUV to her porch on a Tuesday afternoon. That's what brought four lawyers in dark suits walking up a cracked concrete path past the flowerpots Harmony had planted by touch. Claudia stood in the doorway, one arm wrapped tight around that girl. She didn't know which side the lawyers represented, the mothers, the estates, or something else entirely. But when the lead attorney reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick folder, and said the words that would change everything, Claudia realized she'd been wrong about one thing. She had been visible all along. And now someone had finally come to see her. The lead attorney lifted the folder, not to hand Claudia a threat, but to show her a name. "Miss Claudia, my name is James Whitfield. We represent the estate of Derek Cole, and we've been looking for you." He said it like a man who just found something precious. Claudia tightened her arm around Harmony. She didn't know what to do with a lawyer who said he was looking for her. In her experience, people only looked for you when you owed something. But what James Whitfield said next pulled the floor out from under everything she thought she knew. Derek Cole had died 6 months ago, but before the accident, he'd spent 2 years trying to piece together the life he'd abandoned. He'd learned about Harmony from an old hospital record, a social worker's note about a blind infant whose father's identity was listed as unknown. He'd tried to contact the mother, but Tanya had already disappeared, and he'd found Claudia. He never called, never knocked on the door, never sent money. But in the last year of his life, he sat down with a lawyer and wrote a will, and in that will, he put exactly one condition on the inheritance. The full text of the clause that James Whitfield read aloud on that porch: "I direct that all assets of my estate be held for the benefit of my daughter, Harmony Cole, and that no distribution shall be made except for her direct care and education, and only so long as she remains in the custody and care of her maternal grandmother, Claudia Jenkins, who has been her sole guardian since infancy." Claudia's knees buckled. She'd spent 10 years invisible to the world, thinking no one with power had ever looked at her. But a dying man she'd never met had seen her from 3 counties away. He'd seen enough to write her name into a legal document and stake his entire fortune on her remaining the child's protector. The 4 lawyers on her porch weren't here to take Harmony away. They were here to enforce a dead man's final act of seeing. But the relief lasted about 4 minutes. Because James Whitfield's next words were the ones that turned the story from a miracle into a courtroom war. "Miss Claudia, the will is being contested. Harmony's biological mother has filed a motion to void the custody clause as unenforceable. She argues that you have no legal standing, that the will cannot dictate guardianship, and that the child's best interest requires placement with a fit biological parent, her. The estate will fight for the will's intent, but we need you to fight with us." Claudia stared at him. "I don't have money for a fight." "You don't need money," he said. "You need to be exactly who you've been for 10 years, and you need to be ready in 3 days. That's when the emergency hearing is scheduled." 3 days later, Claudia walked into a courtroom in downtown Atlanta with Harmony's hand in hers. She'd put on her best dress, the one she'd bought for church 5 years ago. The sleeves were tight, the hem was uneven, but she walked in with her head up. And then she saw her daughter. Tanya sat at the plaintiff's table in a new blazer and pressed slacks, her hair pulled back tight, her face a mask of controlled grief. She didn't look at Claudia. She looked at the judge like a woman who'd been wronged. And beside her, a lawyer with a briefcase that cost more than Claudia's monthly income, ready to argue that a grandmother who'd never filed a single custody paper was a stranger in the eyes of the law. The hearing that followed was less a trial and more a dissection of Claudia's entire existence. Tanya's lawyer, a man named Reynolds, stood up and told the court that Harmony had been abandoned by her mother. Yes, but that abandonment was a cry for help that had been ignored. He said Claudia had actively concealed the child's whereabouts, blocked Tanya's attempts to reconnect, and wrested control of a disabled child for the purposes of financial exploitation once the inheritance came to light. He said Claudia was 67 years old with severe arthritis and no formal income, and that she had no legal right to make medical decisions, no guardianship papers, and no business raising a blind child to adulthood when a young, capable biological mother was ready to step back in. He made it sound like Claudia had committed a decade-long crime. When Claudia's turn came, James Whitfield stood and called her to the stand. He asked simple questions. How old was Harmony when she came to live with you? 6 months. Has her mother ever provided financial support? No. Has her mother ever called, written, or visited? Claudia paused. Once, she called 3 years ago, drunk, she asked for money, I had none, she hung up and never called back. Has Harmony ever asked about her mother? Claudia's voice cracked. She asks why her mother didn't love her enough to stay. Silence in the courtroom. A long, awful silence that Reynolds immediately tried to break with an objection, but the judge overruled him and told Claudia to continue. So she did. She told the court about the first time Harmony learned to walk, how Claudia had padded every corner of the house with old towels, then clapped and called out so the child could follow her voice like a lighthouse. She told them about the day Harmony came home crying because a child at school had said blind kids couldn't do anything, and how Claudia had spent the whole evening teaching her to pour a glass of water by sound alone, until Harmony could do it without spilling a drop, and then she'd said, "Tell me what I can't do now." She told them about the Braille labels on every jar, the way their whole house was a map made of touch, the bedtime game where Harmony would put her hand on Claudia's heart and say, "I know you're smiling, even if I can't see it." And then Tanya's lawyer made his move. He called an expert, a child psychologist, who testified that blind children require structured professional intervention, sensory therapies, and specialized education that a layperson cannot provide. He said Harmony's developmental outcomes were likely delayed due to inadequate care. He said the grandmother's methods, however loving, were insufficient, and if the court wanted to see the data, he could produce studies showing that informal kinship caregivers, no matter how devoted, often fail disabled children over the long term. It was the turning point of the hearing. Claudia sat frozen, staring at a man who'd never touched Harmony's face or listened to her laugh, reducing a decade of sacrifice to a statistical risk. But James Whitfield stood up again. He had his own expert, an ophthalmologist and developmental specialist named Dr. Evelyn Monroe. She'd evaluated Harmony the day before. She took the stand and said something that rearranged the room. "I've reviewed Harmony's medical and educational history. She is not delayed, she is advanced. She reads Braille at a 7th grade level. She scored in the 95th percentile on auditory processing and spatial navigation. Her grandmother developed a tactile mapping technique that mimics the way the human brain naturally rewires after blindness. I don't know where she learned it, but she taught herself something that most early intervention programs take years to replicate." Then she looked at the judge. "The best data we have on blind children says that love is not a substitute for expertise, but here's the data no one collects. Sometimes, the right grandmother is better than every expert in the building." The room inhaled, but Reynolds wasn't done. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and asked to submit new evidence, a document. A sworn affidavit from Tanya, in which she claimed that Claudia had never told her about the inheritance, had never allowed her to see the child, and had deliberately kept them apart to keep the money for herself. And if the will was valid, it only proved that Claudia had manipulated Derek Cole into thinking she was the only option. The judge accepted it. The tide turned again. James Whitfield stood and asked for a brief recess because he'd just been handed a piece of paper that would either save Claudia or destroy her. That piece of paper was a document that Claudia didn't even know existed. 11 years ago, when Tanya had first left Harmony, a social worker had visited Claudia's house. She'd seen the baby, seen the conditions, seen the love. She'd told Claudia that if she wanted to keep the child, Tanya needed to sign a termination of parental rights. Tanya had signed it, right there in Claudia's living room with a social worker as witness, but it was never filed. Tanya's addiction had spiraled, the social worker was transferred, and the paper got lost in a backlog of bureaucracy. James Whitfield had found it. It had been sitting in a county archive for a decade, unsigned by a judge but notarized. A piece of paper that, if admitted into evidence, would strip Tanya of every legal claim to Harmony for the rest of her life. When court resumed, the judge was handed the document. She read it, her face unreadable. Then she looked at Tanya, then at Claudia, then at Harmony, who had been sitting in the back of the room the whole time, blind to the faces but not to the tension, fingers moving over a small Braille book in her lap. The judge said she would rule on the matter of temporary placement within 48 hours. Until then, she was not prepared to disturb the status quo. Harmony would remain with Claudia. The relief in Claudia's body was so sudden she almost fell into the railing, but James Whitfield grabbed her arm and pulled her aside before she could exhale. "This isn't over," he whispered. "They're going to try to get her removed tomorrow. Reynolds just filed an emergency motion claiming you're endangering her health by denying her formal services. He wants a temporary guardian appointed immediately. The hearing is 9 a.m., and that was when Claudia understood that love, no matter how fierce, could still lose to a system designed to measure it with the wrong tools. She held Harmony's hand and walked out of that courthouse into the Georgia evening, knowing the next 24 hours would decide if a decade of devotion was worth anything at all. That night, Claudia sat on the edge of Harmony's bed in the dark, the way she'd done 1,000 times before. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just telling a story. She was memorizing the sound of the girl's breathing, the weight of her hand on the blanket, the way she tilted her head toward the window even though she couldn't see the stars. James Whitfield had called at 10 o'clock. His voice was tight. He'd just received word that Reynolds had hired a private investigator, someone digging through every record Claudia had ever touched, and he'd found something. The next morning at 9 a.m., the same courtroom. But this time there were more people. A social worker from the Department of Family and Children's Services sat in the front row with a notepad. A court-appointed guardian ad litem, a woman Claudia had never met, stood near the bench. And Tanya's lawyer, Reynolds, rose with a folder thicker than the day before. He asked the judge not to delay. He had new evidence that changed everything. He handed the folder to the judge. Inside was a report from a DFCS investigator who had visited Claudia's home at 7 a.m. that morning. The report described peeling paint, a loose handrail on the porch steps, and plumbing that ran slow. It noted that Harmony's bedroom had no specialized visual aids, no electronic braille display, no mobility cane, only homemade labels taped to jars, and a floor plan memorized by touch. The investigator concluded that the home environment posed a safety hazard for a blind child and recommended immediate placement in a licensed facility until proper accommodations could be ensured. Claudia tried to speak. James held her back. Judge Phillips read the report, her face hardening. And then Reynolds called his next witness, a neuropsychologist who testified that children with congenital blindness require professionally structured sensory integration therapy to develop properly. Without it, he said, they risk isolation, depression, and cognitive plateauing. He cited studies. He used words like critical developmental window. He made a decade of love sound like a slow-motion tragedy. The guardian ad litem was asked for her preliminary opinion. She stood carefully. She said she saw no evidence of abuse or neglect of the child's emotional needs, but she cited the same report. The home was not physically adapted to the specific safety standards recommended for blind children. In the absence of formal oversight, she could not, in good conscience, advise against a temporary supervised placement while the full custody evaluation proceeded. The judge looked at Claudia. She looked at Harmony, who sat in the back row holding her grandmother's worn cardigan because she refused to let go of it. And then the judge said the words that broke Claudia in half. Pending a final custody determination, I'm ordering that the minor child, Harmony Cole, be placed in the temporary custody of the Department of Family and Children's Services for the purpose of a 30-day supervised evaluation in a licensed care facility equipped for children with visual impairments. This order is effective immediately. Claudia did not scream. She did not cry. She turned in her seat and looked at Harmony, and Harmony's face had gone still in the way that blind children's faces go still when they are listening to a world they cannot see falling apart. A social worker walked toward the girl. Harmony heard the footsteps. She reached out her hand, not for the social worker, but for Claudia. Grandma, why is someone coming? Grandma, I can't see you. Please tell me you're still there. Claudia grabbed her. She wrapped both arms around that child, and for 3 seconds, the whole courtroom froze, the bailiff, the social worker, the judge, all of them watching a 67-year-old woman hold a blind girl like the world could end, and it would not matter because they were together. The social worker gently separated them. Harmony's hand caught on Claudia's sleeve and the sleeve tore, a small sound, but it echoed. Then she was gone, led through a side door into a hallway that Claudia was not allowed to enter. Claudia stood there, alone in the middle of the courtroom, her torn sleeve hanging, listening to Harmony's voice fade down the corridor, calling her name. James Whitfield grabbed her arm. He was on his phone. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of a man who had lost. It was the voice of a man who had just been handed a weapon. He turned to Claudia and said 2 things. First, the notarized termination of parental rights, the one Tanya signed 11 years ago, had just been authenticated by the social worker who witnessed it. She was alive. she was in Florida, and she was willing to testify. Second, a journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had been in the courtroom that morning taking notes. And when she heard Claudia's testimony, when she saw Harmony taken from her grandmother's arms, she'd already started writing. The story would go online by tomorrow. The world was about to see what the system had just done, and that changed everything. The article went live at 6:13 the next morning. By noon, it had been shared 40,000 times. The headline read, "She raised a blind granddaughter alone for 10 years. A judge took her away in 3 minutes." The journalist, a woman named Simone Pierce, had not just reported the facts. She told the story, the homemade Braille labels, the grandmother on her knees teaching a blind toddler to walk by sound, the torn sleeve in the courtroom. And she'd included the number that set the internet on fire. 80% of grandparents raising grandchildren have zero legal custody. They are one hearing away from losing everything. The phones at DFCS started ringing and didn't stop. The Guardian ad litem requested an emergency meeting with the judge. A local television crew showed up at Claudia's empty house, filming the chipped paint and the loose handrail and the flowerpots Harmony had planted by touch. They found a neighbor who said she'd watched Claudia sit on that porch every evening, describing the sunset to a little girl who couldn't see it. The story was no longer a legal dispute. It was a mirror held up to a system that measured love with the wrong instruments. James Whitfield moved fast. He filed an emergency motion for reconsideration, attaching the authenticated termination of parental rights, signed by Tanya 11 years ago, notarized, legally binding, and never revoked. The document meant that Tanya was not Harmony's legal mother. She had surrendered that right before the child could walk. Every claim she'd made in court, every tear she'd shed, every accusation of exploitation, all of it collapsed under the weight of her own signature. But the document did something else, something no one expected. It unlocked the will. Derek Cole's estate attorneys had been waiting for exactly this, proof that Tanya had no parental claim, because the will's condition was specific. The inheritance flowed only if Harmony remained with Claudia. With Tanya's rights terminated, there was no competing legal parent. The clause that had seemed like a sentimental wish from a dying man was now ironclad. The estate, frozen for 6 months, was suddenly, irrevocably, Claudia's to administer for Harmony's care. 7 days after Harmony was taken, the courtroom reconvened. This time it was packed. Simone Pierce sat in the front row. Behind her, a dozen grandmothers from around the metro area, women who'd heard the story and ridden buses to be there. The DFCS caseworker who'd written the critical report was called first, and under cross-examination by James Whitfield, she admitted that she'd spent less than 20 minutes in Claudia's home, that she had no training in evaluating accommodations for blind children, and that she'd been unaware that Claudia's tactile mapping system had been praised by a developmental specialist. Her report crumbled on the stand. Then the Guardian ad litem spoke. She told the court she'd made a mistake. She'd visited Harmony in the temporary facility and found the girl withdrawn, refusing to eat, crying for her grandmother. She said she'd spent 3 hours in Claudia's home and realized every bump and texture and sound was intentional, a map built from love. She reversed her earlier recommendation. She now believed the safest, most appropriate placement for Harmony was with her grandmother. Judge Phillips took a long breath. She looked at the termination document. She looked at the estate's filings. She looked at Tanya, who sat rigid in her chair with no more motions to file, no more experts to call. And then she spoke. This court made an error. It measured this home by standards designed for buildings, not for families. It overlooked a decade of demonstrated care in favor of a checklist. The termination of parental rights is valid. The grandmother is the child's psychological parent. The will is upheld. Custody of Harmony Cole is restored to Claudia Jenkins, effective immediately. This case is closed. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, in release. The grandmothers in the back row wept. Simone Pierce typed the final line of her follow-up article on her phone. And Claudia, 67 years old, with arthritis in both hands and a torn sleeve, stood up and walked out of that courtroom, down the hall, and into the visitation room where Harmony had been waiting, not knowing if she'd ever go home again. Harmony heard the footsteps. "Grandma," Claudia knelt down. "I'm here, baby." Harmony reached out, found her grandmother's face with both hands, traced the wrinkles, the tears, the smile. "I knew you'd come back. I counted the days by the meals." "It's been 7, that's not too many." Claudia laughed through tears. "7 is not too many." She took Harmony's hand and they walked out of that building together. The inheritance, when it cleared, came to just under $3 million. It was placed in a trust administered by James Whitfield's firm, with strict disbursement rules: education, medical care, housing, and Claudia's modest living expenses. The first check bought a new roof. The second paid for a Braille tutor and a mobility coach. The third funded a college savings account that would be waiting when Harmony turned 18. And the house with the chipped paint and the loose handrail, it became the first property in the state to be retrofitted entirely around blind navigation, funded by a dead father's guilt and a grandmother's refusal to quit. Here's the detail that will stay with you. 3 weeks after the ruling, a package arrived at Claudia's door. Inside was a letter from Derek Cole's sister, a woman Claudia had never met. She wrote that Derek had kept a photograph of Harmony, a hospital photo from the day she was born. He'd written on the back, "Someday I'll be brave enough." He never was. He never called, never visited, never held his daughter. But he left her everything, and he left her with the one person who'd been brave from the start. Claudia framed that note. She hung it in Harmony's room, next to the first Braille alphabet card she ever made, and she never spoke of Derek with anger. She just told Harmony that her father gave her life twice, once when she was born, and once when his name on a piece of paper brought lawyers to a porch on a Tuesday afternoon. Now here is what happens when a story like this meets a world full of people who think it could never happen to them. It turns out Claudia Jenkins is not rare. She is everywhere. She is everywhere, in every city, in every state, in every neighborhood you drive through without a second look. 6 million children in this country are being raised by grandparents. And here's the number that should keep you up tonight. Fewer than 1 in 5 of those grandparents have any legal custody. Fewer than 20%. That means millions of families are living one phone call, one knock on the door, one signed court order away from being ripped apart, not because the grandparents aren't doing the work, but because the system was never built to recognize work that doesn't come with a form. Claudia was lucky. A journalist saw her, a lawyer fought for her. A dead man's guilt, of all things, finally gave her the legal standing she'd lacked for a decade. But most grandparents in this country don't get that. They stay invisible. They raise children in the shadows of a system that ignores them until the day it destroys them. And that right there is the real story. Not the black SUV or the 4 lawyers or the $3 million inheritance. The real story is the grandmother who did everything right and still almost lost, and the millions of grandmothers who actually do lose because no one is watching. So here's my question for you. Look around. Do you know someone raising a child without papers? A grandmother, an aunt, a family friend who stepped in when no one else would? And if you do, ask yourself what would happen to that child if a stranger knocked on the door tomorrow. Because the difference between Claudia and every other invisible caregiver is not that she loved harder. It's that someone finally saw her. Share this video with someone who needs to understand. Leave a comment if this story hit home. And if you want to be part of a community that refuses to look past the people holding everything together, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Until next time, stay kind and never underestimate the power of showing up.